It was a mildly warm day with clear skies and not a cloud to be seen. The leaves were preparing to change from green to yellow, and fall was right around the corner. For this 21-year-old boy, it meant that today was his first day of his sophomore year of college. Before he rolled out of bed, he made sure to check his notifications. He wasn't fully aware of it, but each morning, as he checked his phone, his brain was anticipating an easy reward. When that happened, it released a little spurt of the motivation molecule, dopamine. By unintentionally conditioning himself to do this every single morning for the past 10 years of his life, ever since he got his first smartphone, his dopamine was programmed to look for the cheapest, easiest ways to get pleasures. And one of those pleasures was an obsession with DMing women on Instagram. A few months ago, he had actually gotten a cute girl to message him back after a dozen unsuccessful DM slides. And so, for the past few months, he had been desperately trying to recreate that same experience. Little did he know, the only reason she decided to reply was to get him to subscribe to her OnlyFans, which he did. His self-control was one of his least developed skills. As he scrolled through the 10 or so DMs he shot out last night when he was feeling extra lonely, he became disappointed with his 0% success rate. He couldn't understand why liking the women's Instagram stories and replying "beautiful" heart eyes emoji wasn't working, and this lack of response only fueled his already low self-esteem. His father had to work 2 jobs just to make ends meet for his family in America, so he didn't have much time to be the father figure his son needed to stop him from acting incredibly desperate towards women he was interested in. After that disappointment, along with a quick 30-minute scroll through TikTok, which felt more like 5 minutes, his now awake brain was transformed from cool, calm, and focused to a barely present, instantly gratifying fueled zombie. He got out of bed feeling anxious enough to the point where his whole body had a slight shake, but managed to prepare himself for school. By the 3rd class of the day, he was suffering from information overload. Not just from his studies, but from the amount of headlines, buzzwords, and short videos he had consumed during and between those classes. Because his brain was programmed to look for stimulation at all times, he would scan his environment like a human slot machine, constantly looking for that next piece of novelty or reward, even if it hurt his discipline in the long run and made him overly paranoid about worldly problems that did not at all relate to him. The class he was in was a random elective that didn't interest him whatsoever. He was an undecided major who thought he might find what he was meant to do if he just stayed in school long enough and tried enough different classes. It was a decent approach, but he completely neglected the thousands of dollars in debt he would soon take on once he graduated or dropped out. He didn't even take the time to question this, though, because his whole life up until that point had been predicated on other people's decisions. This is why his own identity was so confusing to him. Throughout his life, he simply followed the crowd, didn't question the system he was indoctrinated in, and stayed inside a very small bubble of beliefs. And many of those beliefs consisted of the type of content he found himself consuming. He would allow himself to be swayed by any new information the algorithms on the different social media websites fed him, and wouldn't stop to question whether the content was mostly false and made for clicks and engagement, or was made to provide genuine value. And his true identity became even more confusing to him when he was presented with conflicting information online, because he never knew who to trust. So, instead of choosing his own path and his own life aspirations and goals, he let his parents, teachers, friends, and his most heavy influence, the content he consumed, make the decisions for him. This is how he ended up in the typical, you need to go to school, get a corporate job, have a family, and retire race he found himself in. Due to his parents, peers, and all the content he saw of 16-year-olds being millionaires, he already felt behind in life, and so he never gave himself the space needed to really reflect on his actions and failures, grow from them, and question what it was he really wanted out of life. And because the world was evolving at such a fast rate now, with updates to hardware, structures, and technology happening every second of the day, he felt like his skills and prowess would always be behind the competition, and he would never fully have things figured out. No matter how much he tried, he constantly felt like he was chasing an imaginary clock that would give him the life satisfaction he so desperately craved if he were to one day reach it. But he was afraid he never would, and this only exacerbated his stress, confusion, and anxiety. The only hope he clung to was the possibility of being genuinely happy one day. Because all throughout his life, he was told, once you have this much money, respect, or status, then you'll finally be happy. And maybe, just maybe, he could get there one day. After his last class, he went home, ate, played some video games, and scrolled through YouTube. He tried to distract himself as much as possible with mindless consumption so he could avoid his inner demons and never get to the root of his fulfillment and self-worth problems. And as he went through the YouTube recommended page, he came across a thumbnail that looked oddly familiar to him. The thumbnail was his face, with no title and no channel name. But it was still somehow clickable, even though it looked like some sort of glitch. At first, he thought he was asleep. He slapped himself a few times, stood up, went to the bathroom, and threw cold water on his face. But he didn't wake up. What he was seeing was real. Although he was scared shitless, he couldn't resist the urge to click. And so, he did. As he started watching, a sense of eeriness cast over him. What he was watching was an exact replay of his entire day so far, but from a third-person point of view, with the same commentary from the video you are all watching right now. The video sent shivers down his spine, but not even because of this impossible situation he found himself in, but because of how disturbed he was with his own behavior and thoughts. And through that commentary and third-person point of view, he finally became fully aware of everything that was causing him to be delusionally brainwashed. As the video ended, he shut down his computer and sat silently with himself. In the darkness of his room, with the streetlights from his window providing the only visible luminance on his face, something about him started to transform. Nothing about his exterior was changing. He was still that tall, rather lanky 21-year-old boy with a hoodie and jeans on. But what was happening inside him would start a chain of events that would produce a ripple across time. That night, before he went to bed, he wrote about everything he would start to change in his daily routine, and he promised himself that he would set out on a mission to accomplish those changes. It was the next morning. As his alarm went off, he instantly caught the urge to check his phone and stimulate himself. But for the first time in months, he could resist the urge. That simple resistance was enough to boost his self-satisfaction by just a hair. When he went off to school, he was having a hard time focusing in his classes, but not for the usual reason. This time, the reason he was glued to his phone wasn't to mindlessly scroll, but rather to use the infinite amount of information at his fingertips to find solutions to his problems. He realized that much of how he felt in his inner world was interlinked with what he was consuming in the outside world, from the types of people he surrounded himself with, to the food he put in his body, and most notably, the content he would digest. And thus, he found himself engulfed in the world of self-improvement. Amongst all the content creators making videos and posts in this niche, just about 3 of them really resonated with him. They had all gone through similar life experiences as he had, but seemed to have this stuff figured out at a much higher level than him, and he was eager to learn more. The creators gave him some really good advice. He started a journal about his negative thoughts, realized they were a byproduct of his environment and upbringing, and began the process of transforming them through journal prompts and thought experiments. He started to meditate every night before bed, and read tons of self-help books in his free time. He knew he wanted to escape the system he was currently in, so he started to look up different ways to make money online and start a side hustle. And he would go to the gym at least 3 times a week and eat pretty healthy. He started to feel a little better. Naturally, he wanted to share this knowledge with those he cared about, so he would constantly try to put his friends onto self-improvement. Guys, you gotta watch these videos. You don't even realize how brainwashed you are. You gotta start meditating, journaling, and taking cold showers. But soon, the boy came to realize that his friends were on a different journey than him, and he started to relate to them less and less. They were still talking about the latest news, drama, and other unimportant mind-numbing information, which were all things that he became uninterested in and saw as lower-level things. And as a result, he started to spend much more time alone, working on himself. The boy continued on like this for several months, and while he did feel quite alone on his journey, the content he was consuming on a regular basis allowed him to continue pushing onward. But after around 3 months of his new routine, something happened. He was in the middle of one of his meditation practices when he suddenly felt pure emptiness. When he snapped back into his present reality, he realized that his meditation practices he had been doing were a means to an end. In other words, they were simply something to check off on his habits list to make him feel more productive and superior to who he was the day before, as well as other people. The same was true of the rest of the so-called good habits he had adopted. Because he was applying what those self-help YouTubers told him made you a 1% person, he started to convince himself that he was better than everyone and that nobody could ever truly understand him or get on his level. And when he really, truly looked at himself, he realized that he still felt quite worthless. And worst of all, that self-improvement had turned into a slightly healthier way to distract himself from the root of his problems, like putting a band-aid over a wound that would never scab and heal. He still believed and agreed with everything he saw online, but now he was just in a different type of polarizing bubble. He still saw women as these foreign objects, only now his newly inflated ego allowed him to actually talk to them in real life and try to sleep with as many as possible. And he was still chasing happiness, only this time he thought that as long as he escaped the rat race, made a lot of money, and kept searching for the answers from those few people he watched, he would eventually find true fulfillment. The truth was, he hadn't really changed that much at all. He pondered over this realization for several minutes. At first, the thought that nothing he had done had resulted in the progress he wanted to see completely demotivated him. But eventually, it led to an aha moment. The largest overarching factor that fueled his behaviors throughout his life were expectations and beliefs created by others. Even now, many of his self-improvement YouTubers were telling him that when he does all of these things for long enough, then he will be successful and happy. Just like when he was convinced that the other path he was on for the first 20 years of his life would eventually make him happy. It was still another form of brainwashing, but this time it was even more elusive since it was packaged in such positive and promising gift wrap. And when he realized that, he laughed himself silly. There was never anything wrong with him. There was nothing he had to prove in order to be happy, or somewhere he had to get in order to give himself permission to be fulfilled. Rather, he just needed to do what he enjoyed, let life take its course through both positive and negative experiences, and silence the noise that came from other people's opinions and approval. From that point onward, his daily routine didn't change much. He still knew that he was a human being, and that certain practices, like exercising daily, eating well, getting good sleep, and feeding your mind with positive things, would make his life more enjoyable, just like those self-help videos said. But now, with every action he took, he no longer did it out of fear. He wasn't afraid that if he did not decide to meditate or journal or work really hard and hustle, that he would never find happiness and fulfillment. Instead, he did those things simply because they were fulfilling in and of themselves. He realized that those content creators he so idolized were just as human as he was, and they too didn't have all the answers. Sure, they had great and applicable advice, but he no longer took their word as absolute truth, and instead used his own application through his own life experiences to see if what they were talking about was really a positive contribution to his own subjective life. And he stopped being so easily influenced and fear-triggered by their polarizing titles and thumbnails that were also designed for clicks and engagement, just like this video. He fully understood that things were not so black and white as the many different cults and followings on the drama-fueled online world had made them out to be, but rather much more gray, in the middle between black and white. And he really started to think for himself and remain open-minded to all the different beliefs and ways of living, without thinking that his way of living and thinking was the only correct and true way to live. And yeah, there certainly were a lot of new problems his generation was facing, but they weren't nearly as overly dramatized as that video he had watched of himself a few months ago had made it out to be. Whoever was commenting that video of himself he found on YouTube just made it more dramatic because they knew that it would make people more engaged and have them keep watching. After all, you're still watching this video, aren't you? Through that entire process, he started to pick up some things he had since cast away when he became addicted to self-improvement and made it his entire life, like playing the drums and video games sometimes. It was then that he understood that more than anything, more than making a lot of money, getting a bunch of women, and impressing people, he just wanted to live a financially comfortable life where he had the freedom to do what he wanted to do every day. And with that freedom, most of what he would choose to do would be virtually the exact same challenging actions that helped him grow that he had done since starting self-improvement. But now, he was no longer doing those things from a place of lack. He knew that most people were still controlled by much of their animalistic instincts and behaviors, and he still unfortunately kind of had to play this brainwashed game most people were stuck in just so he could make a living. But since he became so aware of it and knew that parts of this brainwashed game were inescapable in order to live and survive, he decided that if he had to play the game, then he might as well try and create an income out of one of his lucrative skills he found enjoyable. He knew that he might not get to a reasonable income for potentially years, but it was easy for him to stay consistent because he was no longer focused on the fake reward, which was the finish line, but rather the real reward, which was the everyday process. Life was never meant to be something to figure out and complete, but rather a reality to be experienced and enjoyed in every single moment. It didn't mean improving himself was meaningless, and it sure didn't mean he was perfect the way he is now. It just meant that now he could forgive himself when he failed, made mistakes, or was controlled by his desires. Life was much more simple than the confusing and complicated system in which he and the rest of humanity was in made it out to be. He kept things simple, focused on presence, and found things to do that he enjoyed that challenged him and delayed his gratification almost every single day. With that approach, he could find meaning in just about everything he did. And when he couldn't find meaning, well, he just shrugged it off, because he knew that the reason his human brain was constantly searching for meaning was mostly due in part to his programming from everything he had experienced thus far in his life. So he just accepted it and let it be. He carried this mindset until a very old age, and although he was never the richest man to live, or the most interesting, charismatic, perfect person in the world, he couldn't have been happier. All because he had figured out that there was never anything to figure out. When the man had eventually died at the old age of 92, he requested that this quote be written on his tombstone. And it read, "You don't know what you want because you have it already." Thank you very much to all the patrons on this channel on Patreon. If you don't know what that is, it's a platform separate from YouTube where I'm putting out exclusive content. You can also talk to me one-on-one over the phone on there. If you want to check that out, link in the description. Really hope you guys enjoyed this story I wrote, and if you're looking for more stories written by me that have a good lesson at the end of them, check out this video. You might love it, and I'm signing off. Peace.